The body is absent, making the body and materials present in post-extractive urban terrains in response to issues of the Anthropocene through speculative and performative practices. As a city founded on gold mining in the 1890s, as we move away from mining as a primary commodity, I suggest that Johannesburg is an Anthropocene city in a state of post-extractive exchange. As we address the questions that emerge around the human-altered planet within the context of Johannesburg, a series of critical issues emerge. Catherine Yosef raises the issues of the Anthropocene and the implication of white colonial attitudes in a billion black Anthropocenes or none, suggesting that the Anthropocene implies a global societal blame when the Anthropocene is largely written, particularly in the South African context, by white colonial extractions at the ongoing expense of black bodies enlisted in its extractions. Thinking that addresses the associated issues of climate change, existing literature has tended to continue the trend of global thinking, absenting the particular in favor of the general, speaking of society at large rather than attempting to consider the individual implications, alternatively addressing only issues of energy consumption to the neglect of embodied carbon, water, and other material issues within the urban terrain. I suggest there are two interrelated absences within the current literature on city making, the actant body and the vital materials from which the urban terrain are constructed. This requires a twofold rethinking, a presencing of the often erased material narratives in the city, along with the surfacing of extractive actions within apartheid eras and the ongoing neo-colonial extractions that result from the turn to global capitalism. In my PhD research Wayfaring Stone, I aimed at contesting the white Anthropocene by reimagining stony matter of the urban terrains as vital and living terrain in which the human body is an active co-laborer in shaping the terrain. Thinking beyond the particulate nature of matters of extraction to thinking of stony matter as vibrant, social, and actant. But am I implicated, you may well ask. Here I respond with Daniel Rothberg's term, implicated subjects. Implicated subjects, Rothberg suggests, occupy positions aligned with power and privilege without being themselves direct agents of harm. They contribute to, inhabit, inherit, or benefit from the regimes of domination, but do not originate or control such regimes. This to me describes both that we inherit implication and suggests that we enact material narratives through our everyday material actions. In her writing on the posthuman, Donna Haraway suggests that in response to extractive attitudes within the Anthropocene, we are required to make kin with the non-human world, becoming compostists rather than posthumanists, who think about and act with materials in spectacular ways. In creative practice, I suggest this requires us to come to know and think about materials through direct encounters with vital materials in living terrains. Thinking body and matter to be one, along a continuing, after Karen Barad's thinking on matter, which forwards the understanding of bodies and matter to be one, indistinguishable from one another, and thus interconnected to one another along a quantum understanding, which directly challenges Newtonian physics on which our material frameworks are predicated. Tim Ingold, the anthropologist, describes this way of coming to know materials as akin to weaving and growing, practices in which the materials traverse the body in the process of becoming. Ingold suggests that we learn about materials from which we make things through engaging with those materials within a material world that pushes back, reminding us repeatedly that material knowledge is created through bodily experience with materials in a weathering world. Within his work, he examines the work of crafting, making, and designing through the lens of art, architecture, anthropology, and archaeology. Ingold emphasizes that making a thing from raw materials within the body of writing is coming to know through haptic encounter, be that through weaving, designing a house, making a hand axe, or forming a mound. He suggests that when we make things, maker and material are in conversation through gesture. Physical acts of making incorporate the whole body and forge an entangled understanding of material agencies which labor to produce the final emergent form. In an essay entitled The Techniques of the Body, Marcel Mauss, in discussing the actions that generate material knowledge, describes these as bodily habitus. What is interesting to me in Mauss's essay is that many of the techniques he describes are techniques in negotiating material as medium. Bodily techniques of walking, climbing, tramping, stomping, tiptoeing, sloshing are techniques to navigate the complexity of earthly terrain and air as wind, swimming, water, dancing, however, becomes not a mode of navigation, but a transcendence of it. Of course, still, other general techniques are employed in navigating matter, pulling, pushing, throwing, holding, along with the techniques of the hand, touching, rubbing, squashing, are all bodily techniques for discovering things about the world and its material qualities. Materializing these extractive narratives is twofold. Firstly, making present global material narratives through speculative practice, and additionally making the body and material present in direct material practices. The first action presences white geology in recent South African history through an exploration of the implication of familial history. Recently, I enacted a collaborative work with the artist Chloe Shane, in which we attempted to make present the often erased materiality of extraction and the related movements of white bodies across the South African terrain from the 1940s to the early 1980s in actions of extractions, through the tracing and mapping of the trajectories of our respective grandfathers, hers a mining engineer and mine a driller who worked for several mining and prospecting companies throughout his adult life. Within this work, we trace the movement of bodies through strings that map the trajectory of movement across the broader landscape, with vertical strings connecting the stones to the extractive actions listed on the surrounding walls, with the aim of making present the actions and consequences of the Anthropocene. Although my grandfather passed in 1981, a full year before I came into the world, as an architect, one cannot help but feel the weight of these actions. If the body does not remember, the terrain certainly does. Registering the passing of human activities in both large and small ways, in the cuttings and scarifications from mining and water developments, to the cumulative choices, movements, and marks we make throughout these terrains. As an architect, I find that in order to address the question of materiality in the Anthropocene, one must think tentacularly, as Donna Haraway suggests, speculating on the interrelationships between extractions, the built form, the weathering urban, between the everyday actions and the decisions of you and I, and the traces we will inevitably leave after we have departed. As I have done with every installation work over the course of my research, the recent installation involved the moving and shifting of stones collected over vast distances, in this case over several years, into the space for the installation. In each of these actions, the body traces its own movements through the terrains, and the stones leave the traces on the body. The dust settles in the lung and nose, cuts and bruises, and abrasions and marks are left by the stones on the body through the handling. In the second iteration of the work, I enact the construction of a cairn made from stone extracted from the central Witwatersrand ridgeline. This work takes place as an embodied exploration of presencing stone through bodily habitus that I have developed in my work. As you read the work, I ask you to reflect upon your own bodily habitus and how you as a creative practitioner are implicated in the Anthropocene, both through the material framing and thinking, but also through the everyday habits which inform these larger impacts. Traced. In the first, we see the movement of everyday people involved in extractive work, their lives and those of their granddaughters, carrying the weight of extractive practices, implicating them by their actions in the issues of the Anthropocene. In the second, we see the everyday habits of making with the larger movements of the body, as she shifts and carries the gesture of the hand in the actions of selecting, stacking, and touching the stones, the particular bodily relation which forms terrains. If we turn back to the medium scale, the body in the vital terrain, we see that making kin, thinking in through and with, requires bodily presence and material action. Without the presence of the body, we are unable to connect tentacularly, unable to understand the interrelations of everyday actions and long-term consequences.